I can occasionally experience frustration at my own perceived lack of success. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a desire for instant gratification. I regularly pull myself up for thinking in that fashion. But it's more of a nagging feeling of insatiable desire for more, culminating in the sense that one's mind is rarely at ease and always thinking, what's the next goal? To the point where you rarely take stock of what you've done or what you've achieved, because the feeling continues and the pressure can feel relentless. It is undoubted that we all feel this. I guess I tend to just feel it more intensely than others. I imagine my main issue at present is self-doubt and self-esteem. I know I have favourable skills and attractive attributes that others don't possess, and I'm often told of this. But such are the internal expectations I have for myself and the subsequent mental pressure I put on myself that I have times when I question if I will ever reach my potential, and this is when the negative self-talk seeps in. This is something that is natural and normal, but something that is often avoided or ignored by others, because they have their own burdens to carry and don't necessarily have the emotional maturity, much less the desire, to help carry the load of another person's troubles. So everyone convinces themselves that they are content and dominating in life, when quite often they are not. This is why the highlight reel of social media breeds inauthenticity, because they are manufactured and manicured personas, shielding one from the difficulties of life, especially the difficulties pertaining to the world of the mind and of the self. So few people will even dare to look inward, simply because they are scared of what they might find. Conversely, I do look inward, but possibly too much, and thus pass harsher judgments upon myself, because I know every one of my strengths, but also every one of my inadequacies and flaws all too well. Just as any individual has times when they are their own best cheerleader or own worst critic. At some point in the future, I plan to read Marcus Aurelius and his work Meditations to consider further embracing Stoicism, better manage my emotions, and then share my thoughts on his work with you. No doubt we could all benefit from that. One of the other key Stoics, Seneca, once said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." This can apply to anxiety and the perceived fears of a future that hasn't yet occurred, and thus Stoicism encourages one to live in the present moment and deal with things as they are in an objective sense. Hence, perhaps one should acknowledge the notion that people are never judging you as much as you judge yourself. Certainly not in the modern liberal world, simply because they are often too wrapped up in their own lives to notice. This is at least a truth that we want to believe or need to believe in order to make life more tolerable. That's why we may be caught off guard and shocked by the internal struggles of a man who from the outside appears attractive, well put together, content, or successful. In terms of relationships and friendships, men relate best with the struggles of other men, and women relate best with the struggles of other women. It is rare to find a companion of the opposite sex who will truly understand you and support or love you. Men are best served to acknowledge that a woman will never love them unconditionally. Thus, it is best for a man to save themselves excessive pain and never become too attached, or never be afraid to walk away if needed. That is the lesson that comes from the breakdown of a relationship. Evidently, as a man, you have to be the one who is in demand, or the one who is worthy of being chased, not the other way around. Cultivate an abundance mentality. There is always another potential suitor, so it needn't matter to you a great deal. Spending too much time caught in the romanticism of finding the one is unproductive. An argument could be made that a rational explanation for the Faustian spirit is that it is just an underlying sense of strong anxiety, or more poetically, an underlying sense of constant dynamic restlessness, constant striving, sometimes to one's own detriment. Consider the notion of adrenal fatigue or mental burnout as possible evidence of this. Deep down, I tend to think that we do desire stability, ease, and the state of homeostasis. But we simultaneously have an inherent understanding that those things equate to the static and fixed sense of having become. They equate to existence rather than life, or more crudely, equate to death. Stopping or even slowing down can at times feel completely untenable and unnerving. Perhaps we do need to feel angst to know that we are in fact alive and acting in the world. It was said that Alexander the Great had a great sense of impatience for himself and for those who could not see, feel, or understand his vision as strongly as him. Few, if any, could or should ever claim to possess a will to power equal to that of Alexander. There's not so much pressure when you don't yet have a pathway to follow or an idea to actualize. But in my estimation, the pressure and impatience is at its greatest when you have a clear destination in mind and yet are still caught in the arduous and slow interim period, the halfway point, as it were, prior to finally reaching the goal. Before completion, it can feel as though your potential great deed or great purpose that you are undertaking will be left unfinished or left unfulfilled. Unless it's just a clear case of narcissistic inflated ego, typically only those with great potential feel the significant pressure of self-imposed expectations, as if their mind is telling them something, and this leads to one either accepting or rejecting the demands of their mind. One may be able to shut down the internal monologue for a brief period, but soon enough an internal conflict will arise, as the demand to live in greater congruence with one's potential reaches fever pitch. As we drift further and further away from any tangible or direct attachment to former greatness, we can forget that despite a growing sense of mysticism surrounding them, the great geniuses or passionate figures of yesteryear, whilst brilliant, were also human beings, just as we are. Hence, it is doubtless that they too felt similar pressure, discontent, or inadequacy. In no way am I deluded enough to directly compare myself to the great men of the past, but I do have an understanding that I possess at least some noteworthy talent and feel the same natural compulsion to express it. In fact, personally, in some ways, I would go as far as to assert that I hold the many achievements, deeds, and eternal ideas of the great men of the past to be more important, more powerful, more meaningful, and more valuable than even my own individual life. I feel indebted to the cultural vanguard. For one could only hope to have a mere fraction of the impact that they had on the world. I can only try to stand on the shoulders of those giants. There have been episodes of quiet nihilism where one can have the thought, if I'm not on the level of the great minds, then I'm a useless fool and not worthy of big dreams or endeavours. But we must remind ourselves not to engage in idolatry to such a degree that it breeds negativity and detracts from our life. The average individual, on the other hand, does not have such thoughts and is not concerned or motivated by things of this profound nature. They go with the flow they feel no great internal pressure, and thus rarely live or achieve anything of particular substance, especially not in the cultural realm. Even if such achievements or the implication of, quote, substance is ultimately meaningless anyway, deep speechless thought and the cultural realm does not even register on the radar of the common man, but it does on mine, and it should on yours. As such, perhaps that simple observation is all one needs for confirmation that I am uncommon, and that alone is encouraging to no end. Thus, where it is possible to do so, you should seek to be uncommon too. Furthermore, I had a brief discussion with a cultured friend who is an exceptional intellectual in his own right, and during the discussion, he brought up Schopenhauer and the pessimistic idea that life is nothing more than toil which is endless and meaningless. Whilst it is pessimistic, there is certainly some truth to it. Once we are born into life effectively holds us hostage, and the internal pressure to strive, otherwise known as the will to live, that one may feel, never relents until we pass. Plus, there was the suggestion that everything we perceive with our senses is merely subjective representations of the truth being something that we will never be able to actually perceive. The realization of this is what nihilism actually is. I did ask the question whether one chooses to be nihilist, yet if nihilism is in fact correct, the answer would be, no, you don't choose to be nihilistic. Life just is meaningless, whether you think it ought to be or not. Schopenhauer's pessimism asserted that life was bad because it can be so harsh and hard. Thus, in his view, non-life was preferable. He took an anti-natalist position because he was sympathetic and didn't want to heap the cruel burden of existence and suffering upon the next generation. Thus, he saw procreation as morally wrong. Yet, once you're alive, you are imbued with the will to live in spite of suffering. Thus, the will is transcendental, a concept outside of oneself, that we may understand etymologically as the notion of willing, as in having will or being willing. But just like truth, we'll never possess will as a thing in itself, because we can't isolate it and perceive it as a thing in itself through our senses. And if we think we have isolated it, that's a subjective claim. However, to stop ourselves from embracing nihilism, we have belief and faith in the Platonic concept of noble lies. Noble lies are what build and maintain social harmony in civilizations, and noble lies give us necessary explanations and meaning in life. But they may still be lies. So yes, the noble lie is a form of coping, but the question is, would you rather cope and live, or not cope and die? Thus, to strive, struggle, and toil is to cope. Nihilism and suffering are inevitable, yet how we approach them depends on the direction our mind goes. Schopenhauer's solution to nihilism was to embrace Buddhism and chastity, effectively aiming to reduce life and thus reduce the suffering that life heaps upon the wider world, or in Schopenhauer's terms, reduce the number of subjective conscious representations and thus reduce the suffering that those representations heap upon the one unconscious world in itself, otherwise known as the transcendental concept of will as the thing in itself devoid of multiplicity, outside of perception by our senses or imagination. In trying to figure out what Schopenhauer meant by will, I considered the notion that it is possible that our concept of the planet, or the unconscious will, would exist even if man went extinct, purely because plants and animals live and act in the world separate to man. Thus, we can perceive that they would continue to live and act in the world, in the way that we perceive to be, quote, natural for them relative to the behavior we have observed from them. Man is unlike the plants and animals that populate the earth, for the nature of their being is raw and pure. Plants and animals are complete and perfectly unified within the bounds of their own world, otherwise known as nature. Man is not unified with nature. He is outside of it. As an example, think of the simple concept of bird watching. The bird is acting, quote, naturally, regardless of the fact that you are watching it or not, as most of the time it has no idea that you are watching it. Man's self-awareness brings with it awareness of the world as an opposite object, and the permanent anguish of realizing oneself as an alien being when amongst nature. But simultaneously, we can't know for sure whether the object, in this case the transcendental will or planet, is a thing in itself or a thing that exists outside of us, because there has to be a subject or representation or someone alive on the planet to even perceive the planet as an object. That old riddle of the tree falling in the woods could possibly be a simple way of explaining it. The transcendental notions of sound and fallen tree only exist outside of us as aspects of the will or things in themselves, because we are present to see and hear the tree fall in the woods in what we perceive as nature. But the objects of sound and tree wouldn't exist as we know them if no person was present acting as the subject to hear or see the tree fall. The concept of nature would not knowingly exist either, because the object that we perceive nature to be only exists consciously because we, the subject, perceive it. Yet even though Schopenhauer advocated for Buddhism and chastity as the solution to nihilism, he understood that these ideals are too difficult for the average person to attain, but he advocated for them all the same. After Schopenhauer came Nietzsche. Nietzsche gained great traction because, in wrestling with the question of nihilism, he offered a different solution to Schopenhauer. Nietzsche's solution, whilst also acknowledging that nihilism was unavoidable, aimed to embrace or amplify life rather than reduce it. Nietzsche aimed to transcend the nihilism through the creation of the Übermensch or overman. He asserted that man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. The German philosopher Oswald Spengler would also later advocate a Nietzschean perspective, which can be referred to as brave pessimism. So to break things down further, the two approaches to nihilism discussed here are the Nietzschean affirmation of life in spite of suffering versus Schopenhauer's negation of life to limit suffering. In basic terms, the brave pessimist would likely approach nihilism in this fashion. Yes, we suffer, and life is hard, and it lacks a great deal of meaning. But so what? We will bravely affirm life anyway, as it is our self-imposed duty to do so. And we have no choice or option of the era into which we are born. Only the option to do the necessary or nothing, to push on or stagnate despite inevitable eventual collapse. In a quote that is clearly influenced by Schopenhauer's concept of will, Oswald Spengler wrote the following in his magnum opus, The Decline of the West. There are no men in themselves, as the philosophers prattle about, but only men of a time, of a locality, of a race, of a personality type, who contend in battle with a given world and win through or fail, while the universe around them moves slowly on with a godlike unconcern. This battle is life, and life in the true Nietzschean sense of a cruel, pitiless, relentless battle deriving from the will to power.